Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you're watching this. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, I want to wrap up Trail of Lightning and discuss a little bit about the conclusion to the book. I also want to spend a little time talking about why I believe it's important to use fiction in a class about critical thinking, critical writing, critical reading. So let's try to do that second thing at the beginning, and then we'll run through and hopefully tie everything together with a short discussion about the novel's conclusion. I believe that prose fiction allows readers to create a world. I stole this from an article written a few years back. Neil Gaiman, one of the great authors of the past 20 years or so, discusses that prose fiction helps people create a world. And by helping people create the world, they return slightly changed. I think that this is an important element. Reading, whether it's history or whatever all else, should change the reader a little bit. Whether it's intellectually, whether it's emotionally, it should change the reader a little bit. Second, I think it's important to understand that everything was at some point imagined. Gaiman gets super practical about this. The idea that the room that we're sitting in, the building, people daydreamed and pondered and imagined a way to build a place that we wouldn't get rained on, to build a place that would keep us warm without a big roaring fire right next to us, to build something so that we weren't living in a cave. Everything was at some point imagined. And it's that combination of imagination and the need to change ourselves, even if it's only slightly, that I think is an important thing as far as us reading fiction. And I think it's an important element that allows us to think about how did imagination change things in the book, and how does imagination change things in the broader world. All of this is predicated on the idea that people need to read, and that an author, according to Gaiman, needs to create a tale that they, the author, cannot stop themselves from reading. And hopefully, by creating that tale, they will create a tale that the readers cannot stop themselves from reading. If you look at the last sentence, we have an obligation never ever, under any circumstances, to write anything that we would not want to read ourselves. He puts that in the context of children, but I think that appeals to adults as well. All of that boils down to, again, why do we read? And I think the answer is readers read to be surprised and delighted. Readers read for that element of surprise. And sometimes we English teachers do something really dumb. We talk about find the foreshadowing, look at all of the foreshadowing. And we look at the foreshadowing as an end unto itself, not a means to an end. Foreshadowing should be a means to an end, a means to the delight, a means to say, oh my gosh, why didn't I figure that out? This is awesome. So let's take a look at some of that foreshadowing as we go through and hopefully see a little bit of surprise and hopefully a little bit of delight at the conclusion of this novel. I'll begin with the question, when should we have known? And remind you that we're talking about analysis. We're talking about separation of an intellectual or material whole into its constituent parts. So this is an intellectual whole. We're breaking it down into its constituent parts. And then the highlighted part, we are going to study the interrelationships in how they make up the whole. And by that study, ask the question, when should we have known? We begin with page 17, the coyote. It kept its distance. It was this pair of yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness. But at the same time, there's this hint about coyote being a bad sign. It's bad luck on page 52. Crossing a coyote is bad luck, and crossing here can be twofold. It can be to make angry, or it can be just that it coming across, interacting with. And so now she has interacted with the coyote on page 17. Page 52, we find that this might be a bad thing. Coyote, Mai, tells Maggie to prepare for the monsters are coming. And he is amused at this warning. The fact that she doesn't trust him after all of these years. He's told her the monsters are coming. He has linked himself to some monsters. She doesn't trust him. And he thinks that's kind of funny. The fact that Kai and Mai are getting along is a disaster in the making on page 103. So now we have an amused coyote, Mai. We have the threat of crossing a coyote. That's happened already. We have the warning that there's this disaster in the making. And then we have Coyote grinning this predator grin after Maggie has threatened to put a bullet in his head. He doesn't seem too worried by anything that's going on. He doesn't seem too worried by what is actually going to happen. We have Coyote with this an omission, perhaps. We have Maggie's suspicion continuing, if it's on page 203. Coyote is saying, "You may well curse me before this is over." Mai's helping, but it's for his own purposes. He's still not entirely trustworthy. We have suspicion. We have an admission, "You're going to curse me before this is over." There's layer upon layer upon layer upon layer to get us to the payoff. Page 236, we find out that he has set the whole thing up. Coyote has indeed lived up to the trickster part of his persona. And there's a payoff. Now, perhaps for some of you, this part might be a spoiler, but I think all of you need to, who haven't finished the book, need to sit down and think about, is there another payoff? Is there another thing that was set up? Think about what we talked about in the illusions presentation and think about the payoff for all of that. Those of you who have finished the book, think about the very ending, the very last couple of sentences, and then think about the illusion section. Think about, in particular, the allusion to Timex. Think about, in particular, the reference to the Energizer Bunny. Think about how Maggie survives the encounter with Nezahani. And try to put together, where's the sequel going to come from? Because this is going to be the first part of a trilogy. All of these fantasy books go in 2 or 3 or 6 or 26 or 86 story arcs. Look at the payoff. Did it produce some surprise? Did it produce some delight? Did the page, was it worth it to keep the pages turning? I told you guys when we started this book, and with The Cold Dish and with Ordinary Grace, I picked books not because they were the greatest literary books in the world. I picked books I enjoyed, and I hope you enjoy them too. That should wrap this one up. But again, the point is read to be surprised, read for delight. But as we're doing this, think about ever so often, how did this surprise happen? How did this delight get produced? How is this imaginary world doing something to change me as a reader? And we're going to wrap it up here. Hope everyone has a good one, and I hope to see you in the next class period.